"You're not welcome near my son anymore. Mom, leave before you ruin his family," Daniel Hayes said in the maternity ward hallway, loud enough for every nurse, visitor, and passing orderly to hear. And Margaret Hayes stood frozen with a pale blue gift bag hanging from one hand and a bouquet of white roses in the other, as the words struck harder than anything she had imagined her own child could ever say. For a moment, the entire corridor seemed to go silent around her. The beeping monitors from distant rooms, the squeak of rubber soles against polished hospital floors, the muffled crying of newborns behind closed doors. All of it faded beneath the sharp sting of humiliation spreading through her chest. She stared at her son, searching his face for some sign this was a misunderstanding, some hint of the little boy she had once held through fevers and nightmares, but all she found was a coldness in his expression she had never seen before. Beside him stood his wife, Lauren, one manicured hand resting possessively on his arm, her lips curved into the faintest smile, a smile so slight that anyone else might have missed it, but Margaret saw it clearly. She saw the satisfaction in it. "Daniel," she said quietly, struggling to keep her voice steady, "I drove 3 hours to meet my grandson. I only wanted to congratulate you. You've done enough already," Lauren replied before Daniel could answer, her tone sweet in the way sugar turns bitter when left too long in the sun. "This is our family moment. We don't need your drama here." Margaret's fingers tightened around the roses until a thorn bit into her palm, but she did not flinch. Several people in the hallway glanced over, then quickly looked away with the embarrassed discomfort of strangers witnessing private cruelty in public. Daniel crossed his arms. "You need to go. Mom, we mean it." The words landed with brutal finality. Margaret looked past them toward the hospital room door, toward the grandson she had spent months knitting blankets for, the child whose nursery she had quietly furnished with gifts and books and hand-stitched keepsakes. She had imagined this day so many times, holding that baby for the first time, kissing his forehead, whispering how loved he already was. Instead, she stood in a hospital hallway being treated like an intruder. Her throat burned, but she swallowed the pain down until it settled somewhere deep and hard inside her. Then, with all the dignity she could gather from the wreckage of that moment, she lowered the bouquet, placed the gift bag gently on the nearest chair, and nodded once. "Congratulations on your son," she said, her voice calm enough to surprise even herself. Then she turned and walked away, each step measured, each breath shallow, refusing to let them see the way her hands trembled. She did not look back when the elevator doors closed. She did not cry in the parking garage as she climbed into her Buick. She did not allow herself to brake while the engine started and the windshield blurred with rain she hadn't realized had begun to fall. But as she drove home with the empty passenger seat beside her, and the untouched baby blanket folded in the back, one thought repeated in her mind with growing clarity: children do not wake up one day and become strangers by accident. Something had poisoned her son against her long before today. And as Margaret gripped the steering wheel and watched the highway stretch gray and endless before her, she realized with a cold certainty that the humiliation in that hospital hallway had not been the beginning of the story. It had only been the moment she finally understood how far the betrayal had already gone. Margaret did not turn on the radio during the drive home. She let the silence fill the car, thick and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic swipe of the windshield wipers and the faint rustle of the baby blanket in the back seat every time she made a turn. By the time she pulled into the driveway of the colonial house she had lived in for 32 years, dusk had settled over the neighborhood, washing everything in a cold blue light that made the place feel unfamiliar. She sat behind the wheel for several long moments, staring at her front porch without moving, as if walking through that door would somehow make what happened at the hospital real in a way she still was not prepared to face. When she finally stepped inside, the quiet of the house pressed in around her like a weight. No husband waiting in his armchair with the evening news on. No warm voice calling from the kitchen asking how the visit went. Robert had been gone for 4 years now, but on nights like this, his absence felt newly cruel. Margaret placed her purse on the entry table with mechanical care, then carried the untouched baby blanket and the second gift bag into the nursery she had prepared in the spare bedroom months ago, when Lauren first announced the pregnancy. Pale yellow walls, a white rocking chair by the window, shelves lined with children's books she had saved from Daniel's childhood. She had built that room on hope alone, convinced there would be afternoons spent babysitting, weekends with laughter in the backyard, Christmas mornings with little feet racing down the hallway. Now the room looked less like a future and more like a monument to foolishness. She sat in the rocking chair and let her gaze move slowly across the neatly folded onesies, the stuffed animals arranged in the crib, the framed handprint kit still unopened on the dresser. Then the memories began coming in sharp, unwanted flashes. Lauren insisting the baby shower had been rescheduled, only for Margaret to later see photographs online proving it had happened exactly when originally planned. Daniel claiming they had forgotten to invite her to the gender reveal because of last-minute chaos. Lauren laughing lightly when Margaret arrived at their house with homemade casserole during Lauren's difficult second trimester and saying, "We are really trying to establish boundaries now that we are becoming parents." At the time, Margaret had told herself young couples needed space, that things changed when sons married, that every mother had to learn how to step back. But sitting in that dim nursery with the evening shadows stretching long across the floor, she saw the pattern with painful clarity. None of it had been accidental. It had not been miscommunication. It had not been bad timing. It had been a slow, deliberate erasure. A campaign carried out in polite smiles and carefully chosen words until her own son could look her in the eye and cast her out like an inconvenience. Her chest tightened as the realization settled over her. This had not begun in the hospital hallway. It had begun years ago, one small exclusion at a time, each wound disguised as something harmless until the damage was impossible to ignore. Margaret closed her eyes and leaned back in the rocking chair, gripping the wooden arms until her knuckles whitened. The tears finally came then, silent and hot, slipping down her cheeks not only for the grandson she had not been allowed to hold, but for the son she had lost long before today. And somewhere beneath the grief, beneath the humiliation and heartbreak, another feeling began to take shape, quieter than anger, colder than pain, clarity, because now that she could finally see what had been done to her, she could never again pretend it had been anything less than intentional. Margaret barely slept that night. She lay awake in the darkness of her bedroom, staring at the ceiling while memory after memory surfaced with brutal new meaning, each one fitting neatly into a pattern she had been too hopeful to recognize before. When Daniel first introduced Lauren 3 years earlier, Margaret had welcomed her with open arms. Lauren had been polished and charming then, the kind of woman who knew exactly what to say at dinner, and always brought expensive wine with a gracious smile. She had called Margaret Mom by the second month and insisted they were going to be best friends. Margaret had believed her. She had even bragged to her friends about how lucky she was that her son found such a poised, accomplished woman. But looking back now, Margaret saw how quickly things had changed after the wedding. At first it was subtle. Daniel stopped dropping by on Sunday afternoons because Lauren had planned brunch with friends. Holiday dinners became shorter because Lauren wanted to split time fairly between families, though somehow her own parents always received the longer visits. Phone calls with Daniel grew rushed and distracted. If Margaret asked him a simple question about work or his health, Lauren would answer for him before he could speak. "He is exhausted, Margaret. He does not need extra pressure right now. We are very busy in this season of life." Always we. Always a gentle correction that reminded Margaret her son no longer belonged to himself. Then came the first moment that truly unsettled her. Daniel had missed her 65th birthday dinner. He had called 30 minutes beforehand sounding strangely rehearsed, apologizing that Lauren had a migraine and needed him home. Margaret accepted it without complaint. 2 hours later, Claire, Daniel's younger sister, accidentally posted a family photo from a downtown steakhouse where Daniel and Lauren were celebrating Lauren's friend's engagement. Daniel had not even realized the lie had been exposed. When Margaret quietly asked him about it days later, he looked embarrassed for only a second before saying, "Lauren thought it would be easier than upsetting you." Easier than upsetting you. The words had stayed with her for months. Not because of the missed dinner, but because of how naturally he had justified deceiving her. There had been other moments too. Lauren insisting Margaret should not keep a spare key to Daniel's home because new families need privacy. Lauren discouraging Daniel from helping when Margaret's water heater burst because they needed to prioritize their own household. Lauren rolling her eyes whenever Margaret offered advice and joking to others that older women had trouble letting go of control. Each insult had come wrapped in politeness, each slight delivered with a smile just warm enough to make confrontation seem unreasonable. And Daniel, little by little, had changed. The easy warmth he once carried around his mother faded into guarded impatience. He stopped confiding in her. He stopped asking her opinion. He began treating every interaction like a negotiation between his wife and his mother rather than a natural bond between parent and child. Margaret had told herself it was marriage, adulthood, the natural distance of sons growing into men. But deep down she had known something was wrong long before she admitted it. As pale morning light crept through the curtains, Margaret rose from bed and walked to the kitchen in silence, her bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. She poured herself coffee and stood at the window overlooking the backyard where Daniel had once played Little League with his father every summer evening until sunset. She could still picture him at 8 years old, dirt on his knees, grinning wide as he ran toward home plate while she clapped from the deck. That boy had loved her without hesitation. So what kind of poison had to be poured into a man's heart to make him treat his mother like a threat on the day his own child was born? Margaret wrapped both hands around the warm mug and stared out into the stillness of the yard. Whatever had happened to Daniel had not happened overnight. It had been engineered patiently, carefully, over years. And for the first time, Margaret allowed herself to admit the truth she had resisted for far too long. Lauren had never wanted to join this family. She had wanted to control it. 3 days passed without a word from Daniel. No apology. No explanation. No awkward text pretending nothing had happened. The silence itself told Margaret everything she needed to know. If he felt guilt, Lauren had already found a way to soothe it. By the 4th morning, Margaret stopped checking her phone. She rose early, dressed carefully, and forced herself through the routines of ordinary life, watering the hydrangeas along the front walk, folding laundry, paying bills at the kitchen table beneath the same chandelier where her family had once gathered every Sunday. It was just after noon when the doorbell rang. Margaret opened it to find Claire standing on the porch, her younger daughter's face pale and tense beneath oversized sunglasses. "Can I come in?" Claire asked quietly. Margaret stepped aside without a word. They sat in the kitchen with untouched coffee between them, and for several moments Claire simply stared into her mug as if trying to gather courage. Finally she exhaled and said, "I was at the hospital after you left." Margaret's spine straightened. "Then you know what happened?" Claire nodded grimly. "I know more than that." A cold stillness settled over the room. Claire removed her sunglasses and looked directly at her mother, eyes shining with restrained anger. "Mom, Lauren has been telling Daniel for over a year that you are emotionally manipulative. She says you guilt him every time he visits you. She says you are obsessed with controlling his life and that you are going to try to turn the baby against her the way you supposedly turn dad against people." Margaret stared at her, too stunned to speak. Claire continued, her voice shaking now. "She told Daniel you would try to make their son love you more than his own parents if they did not set boundaries early. She has convinced him that keeping you away is protecting their family." Margaret felt the air leave her lungs in a slow, Painful exhale. That is insane. She whispered. I know, Claire said. But Daniel believes her. Or at least he has convinced himself to. Claire reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. There is more. She scrolled for a moment, then slid the screen across the table. It showed a text conversation between Claire and Lauren from 2 weeks earlier. Margaret's eyes moved over the words, and her stomach turned colder with every line. Lauren had written, "Once the baby comes, Daniel needs to stop pretending his mother is part of our immediate family. If we do not make the separation clear now, she will be in our lives forever." Another message followed. He needs to choose who his real family is. Margaret read the lines twice, then a third time, her hands growing numb around the phone. Claire's voice softened. I did not tell you because I hoped Daniel would come to his senses before it got this far. But after what happened at the hospital, you deserve to know. Margaret handed the phone back slowly. Her mind reeled through years of excuses, softened truths, and polite dismissals. And suddenly every piece fit together with devastating precision. Lauren had not merely disliked her. She had been running a quiet campaign to remove her entirely. Not from Daniel's schedule. Not from holiday plans. From his life. Margaret stood and walked to the sink, gripping the edge of the counter so hard her fingers ached. Outside the kitchen window, a breeze stirred the maple tree Robert planted the year Daniel was born. She watched its branches sway and understood with painful clarity that this had never been about misunderstandings or personality conflicts. This had been strategy, calculation, isolation. Claire rose behind her. What are you going to do? She asked softly. Margaret did not answer right away. She stared at her reflection in the glass above the sink, a woman with silver hair, tired eyes, and a face older than it had looked a week ago. But beneath the hurt, beneath the grief, something in that reflection had changed. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm enough to make Claire go still. Nothing dramatic. Margaret said, if Lauren wants Daniel to choose his new family over the one who raised him. She turned from the window, her expression composed, almost serene. Then I will let him live with that choice. Margaret began making changes the very next morning, and she did so with the same calm precision she had once used to run a household, balance a family budget, and build a life from scratch beside her late husband. She did not call Daniel. She did not send emotional messages demanding explanations. She did not give Lauren the satisfaction of drama. Instead, Margaret scheduled appointments, first with her attorney, then with her financial advisor, then with the estate planner who had handled Robert's affairs after his passing. By the end of the week, every document that still listed Daniel as automatic beneficiary, co-trustee, or future executor had been revised. The family trust that had quietly been structured to help Daniel one day purchase a larger home was redirected entirely. The educational investment account Margaret had been building for her future grandchildren remained intact, but under new terms that no parent could access or influence. She also canceled the monthly transfer she had been sending Daniel for nearly 2 years, a contribution he had insisted was temporary, while he and Lauren adjusted to their mortgage. Margaret doubted Lauren even knew that money had come from her. That Friday afternoon, Daniel called for the first time since the hospital. Margaret watched his name flash across her phone while she stood at the kitchen counter slicing apples for a pie. She let it ring twice before answering. Hello, Daniel. There was a pause, as if he had expected resentment and did not know what to do with calmness. Mom, he said awkwardly. I noticed the transfer did not come through this week. Margaret set the knife down carefully. That is correct. Another silence. Was there some kind of banking issue? He asked. No. Margaret replied. I simply decided that if I am no longer considered part of your family, then I should stop financing it. The quiet that followed was so complete she could hear his breathing through the phone. "Mom, do not do this," he said at last, his voice tightening. "Do what?" she asked gently. "Respond to your choices accordingly? That is not fair." Margaret almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, but because unfairness had apparently become visible to Daniel only when it inconvenienced him. Fairness, she said evenly, would have been allowing a grandmother to meet her grandson instead of humiliating her in a hallway full of strangers. "Lauren and I were trying to protect our peace," Daniel said, slipping into the language that now sounded less like his own and more like borrowed lines from someone else's script. Margaret's voice remained steady. "Then protect it with your own money." She ended the call before he could respond. 2 days later, Claire phoned with an update. "He is furious," she said. "Lauren is worse. Apparently they were counting on your transfer for the new nursery furniture. And Daniel just found out the savings account for the house down payment is gone too." Margaret folded laundry as she listened, matching socks with serene focus. "I imagine that is disappointing for them." Claire gave a short laugh. "You are terrifying when you are calm. You know that?" Margaret smiled faintly. But once the call ended, she stood alone in the laundry room and let the quiet settle around her. There was no joy in this. No triumph. Only the sober recognition that some people never value what they have until it is removed. She had spent years being useful, generous, available, dependable. She had mistaken being needed for being loved. Now Daniel was learning the difference. And Margaret knew this was only the beginning, because financial discomfort had a way of exposing truths that pride and manipulation could keep hidden for only so long. Within 2 weeks, the cracks in Daniel and Lauren's carefully polished life began to show. Margaret did not need Claire to tell her at first. She could see it herself in the subtle signs that started appearing online. The expensive brunch photos disappeared from Lauren's social media. The weekly date nights stopped. The new designer diaper bag Lauren had boasted about before the baby's arrival was suddenly replaced by something plain and practical. But Claire kept her informed anyway, delivering quiet updates with the kind of disbelief only a sibling could carry. "They are fighting constantly," she said during one phone call. Lauren thought Daniel had more savings. Daniel thought she was managing their budget better. Turns out neither of them knew how much your help was covering. Margaret listened in silence while trimming dead roses in the backyard. She had never hidden her support from Daniel, but she had never advertised it either. A few $100s here. Help with closing costs there. Emergency car repairs. Contributions toward furniture. Quiet generosity layered so naturally into his adult life that he had begun to treat it like weather. Constant, dependable, barely noticed until it changed. Then, one rainy Thursday evening, Daniel appeared at her front door without warning. Margaret opened it to find him standing on the porch with dark circles under his eyes and tension carved into every line of his face. He looked older than he had just a month before. "Can we talk?" he asked. Margaret stepped aside and let him in. He stood awkwardly in the foyer for a moment, glancing around the house as though seeing it clearly for the first time in years. The framed family photographs on the wall. The polished staircase banister he used to slide down as a boy. The grandfather clock Robert had wound every Sunday. Margaret led him to the kitchen and poured coffee for them both, though neither touched it. Daniel sat at the table with his hands clasped tightly together. "Things have been stressful," he began. Margaret said nothing. "The baby has not been sleeping. Lauren is exhausted. Bills are piling up faster than we expected." He hesitated. "I think maybe we all let emotions get out of hand at the hospital." Margaret looked at him steadily. "Is that what you think happened?" He shifted uncomfortably. "I am trying to say maybe everyone overreacted." Margaret almost admired the audacity of that sentence. Your wife smiled while you humiliated me in front of strangers. She said calmly, you barred me from meeting my grandchild and treated me like a danger to your family. Do not insult me further by pretending that was mutual overreaction. Daniel's jaw tightened. Lauren has concerns. Lauren has control. Margaret interrupted softly, and the quiet force of it stopped him cold. Do not confuse the two. He stared at her, and for the first time in years Margaret saw uncertainty flicker across his face. Not understanding yet. Not remorse. But doubt. Small, fragile, and deeply uncomfortable. She says you never respected our boundaries. He muttered, though the words lacked conviction. Margaret leaned back in her chair. Daniel, if your wife truly believed I was harmful, she would not have accepted my money for years while painting me as a threat. She would not have welcomed my gifts, my labor, my support, and then cast me aside the moment she felt secure enough to do so. He opened his mouth, then closed it, because he knew. Perhaps not fully, perhaps not enough, but somewhere inside him, he knew. Margaret folded her hands neatly on the table. You made your choice at that hospital. I am simply honoring it. Daniel stood abruptly, anger flashing across his face because anger was easier than shame. You are being vindictive. Margaret met his gaze without flinching. No, Daniel. Vindictive would require hatred. This is simply the natural consequence of teaching someone. They may discard you, while still expecting your support. He left moments later without another word, the front door closing harder than necessary behind him. Margaret remained seated at the kitchen table long after his taillights disappeared down the street, her untouched coffee gone cold beside her. She knew that conversation had not repaired anything, but for the first time, she had seen something crack in Daniel's certainty. And once doubt enters a controlled mind, truth rarely stays far behind. The weeks that followed did not bring peace to Daniel's household. They brought pressure. The kind that seeps into every room when two people have built a life on assumptions they can no longer afford. Claire's updates became less frequent because Margaret no longer needed them. The truth was beginning to reveal itself without anyone's help. Daniel started calling more often, though never with the words Margaret knew he should say. He would ask practical questions disguised as casual conversation. Did she know a good pediatrician in their area? Could she recommend a reliable handyman? Did she happen to still have the contractor contact who renovated her kitchen? It was as if he were circling the edge of reconciliation without ever daring to name the wound between them. Margaret answered politely but briefly, offering nothing beyond what basic courtesy required. Then, one Sunday afternoon nearly 6 weeks after the hospital incident, Claire arrived at Margaret's house with an expression so grim it made Margaret set down her teacup before a word was spoken. Lauren got caught, Claire said. Margaret frowned. Caught doing what? Claire sat across from her at the kitchen table and leaned forward. Lying. Repeatedly. According to Claire, Daniel had accidentally discovered that Lauren had been deleting text messages and emails for months. Messages Margaret had sent checking in during the pregnancy, offering help, asking after doctor appointments, sending kind notes and thoughtful gifts. Lauren had intercepted them, erased them, and told Daniel his mother had stopped caring. Worse still, Daniel learned that Lauren had lied about multiple interactions, claiming Margaret had criticized her parenting plans, mocked her family, and made insulting comments Margaret had never spoken. Daniel found the messages because Lauren left her tablet open while she was showering, Claire said. He was looking for an invoice, and everything came up synced. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, not in triumph, but in weary confirmation. She had known. Perhaps not every detail, but enough. There was a long silence before Margaret asked quietly, "And what did he say?" Claire let out a humorless laugh. Apparently he confronted her, and she tried to claim she only did it because she was afraid you would take him away from her. Then she cried. Then she said postpartum stress made her do things she did not mean. Margaret looked down at her folded hands. The explanation was almost insulting in its predictability. And Daniel? Claire shook her head. He does not know what to think. He keeps calling me asking whether I knew. He sounds, she paused, destroyed. That evening, Daniel called again. Margaret let it ring once before answering. His voice was rough, stripped of the certainty it had carried for so long. Mom, he said quietly, can I come over? Margaret stared out the kitchen window at the fading gold light over her backyard. Tomorrow, she replied. At noon. The next day he arrived looking like a man who had not slept. He stood in her doorway, shoulders slumped, eyes red-rimmed, suddenly less like the polished professional Lauren had shaped and more like the lost young man he once had been. Margaret led him inside, and when they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, he did not begin with excuses this time. He simply looked at her and said, I think I made a terrible mistake. Margaret held his gaze without softening. No, she said quietly. You made many. Repeatedly. The words hit him like a blow. His face crumpled with the force of long-delayed understanding. I did not know. He whispered. Margaret's expression remained steady. You did not want to know. Tears filled his eyes then, and for the first time since this began, Margaret saw real shame instead of defensiveness. But even as she watched her son begin to grasp the ruin he had allowed into his life, she knew one revelation did not undo years of betrayal. Truth may arrive in a single moment. Trust never does. Daniel sat in Margaret's kitchen for nearly 2 hours that afternoon, and by the time he left, the polished certainty that had once defined him seemed entirely gone. He confessed everything in fragments, as if each truth physically pained him to speak aloud. Lauren had controlled more than his messages. She had screened his calls, twisted ordinary remarks into insults, fabricated slights, and fed his insecurities with constant whispers that his mother wanted to undermine their marriage. Every time Margaret had looked hurt or confused, Lauren had told him it was manipulation. Every time Margaret stepped back, Lauren said it was proof she had never truly cared. I kept believing if I just protected my marriage, everything would settle down, Daniel said, staring at the grain of the kitchen table like he could not bear to look directly at his mother. I thought setting boundaries meant choosing my wife over everyone else. Margaret listened in silence until he finally asked the question she knew had been building inside him since the moment he arrived. Can you ever forgive me? She regarded him carefully before answering. Forgiveness is not the same as trust, Daniel. He nodded with tears in his eyes, as if he understood that distinction more deeply than he ever had before. 3 days later, Lauren appeared at Margaret's front door uninvited. She stood on the porch in oversized sunglasses and a cream trench coat despite the mild weather, her posture rigid with forced dignity. Margaret opened the door but did not invite her inside. Lauren removed her sunglasses and offered the brittle smile of someone accustomed to charming her way out of consequences. I think there have been misunderstandings, she began. Margaret said nothing. Lauren shifted. Daniel is overreacting. I admit I may have handled some things poorly after the baby came, but I was overwhelmed, emotional, and trying to protect my family. Margaret's gaze remained cool and unreadable. Your family? She asked softly. Lauren swallowed. You know what I mean. No, Margaret replied. What I know is that you isolated my son from his mother, lied for years, humiliated me publicly, and tried to erase me from my grandson's life before he was old enough to open his eyes. Lauren's polished expression cracked. I was trying to establish boundaries. Margaret stepped slightly forward, her voice still calm, still measured, and somehow all the more cutting for it. Boundaries are discussed honestly. Manipulation is done in secret. Do not insult me by confusing the two. Lauren's face hardened. The mask slipped entirely then. You always thought you knew better than everyone else, She snapped. You were always there. Always hovering. Always making him feel guilty. I did what I had to do for my marriage. Margaret's expression did not change. And now you will live with what that cost you. She closed the door before Lauren could respond. That night Daniel called again. His voice was hollow. She admitted enough. He said. Not everything. But enough. There was a pause. I asked her to stay with her sister for a while. Margaret stood at her bedroom window, looking out over the dark yard where the porch light cast long shadows across the grass. I am sorry, Mom, Daniel whispered. For all of it. I do not expect you to fix this. I just needed you to know that I finally see it. Margaret closed her eyes. There was sorrow in his voice now. Real sorrow. The kind that comes only after illusion dies. Seeing it is the beginning. She said quietly. Not the end. After the call ended, Margaret remained by the window for a long time, watching the reflection of her own face in the glass. She felt no victory. No thrill of revenge. Only the solemn ache of a woman who had been proven right in the worst possible way. Her son had finally opened his eyes, but only after helping someone nearly destroy the bond they once shared. And some damage, Margaret knew, could be repaired only slowly, if at all. 2 weeks passed before Margaret saw her grandson for the first time. Daniel brought him alone on a quiet Sunday afternoon, standing on her porch with an infant carrier in one hand, and an expression so humbled it barely resembled the man who had once turned her away from a hospital hallway. Margaret opened the door and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Daniel extended the carrier toward her with trembling hands. If you are willing, he said softly, I would like you to meet him now. Margaret looked down at the tiny child sleeping beneath a pale blue blanket, his small fist tucked near his cheek, his chest rising and falling in delicate little breaths. Something inside her ached so sharply she had to steady herself against the door frame. She stepped aside without a word. Inside the living room, sunlight spilled through the windows in warm bands across the carpet as Daniel carefully lifted the baby into her arms. Margaret held her grandson against her chest and felt tears gather instantly in her eyes. He was warm and impossibly small, with Daniel's nose and a faint tuft of dark hair. For several long moments the room was silent except for the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock and the soft sounds of the baby breathing. Margaret kissed the top of his head gently and whispered, Hello there, sweetheart. Daniel sat across from her, his face wet with tears he did not try to hide. I should have protected you, he said hoarsely. Instead, I let someone convince me that loving you made me disloyal to my wife. I do not know how to live with what I did. Margaret rocked the baby slowly, her gaze never leaving the child's sleeping face. You live with it by becoming better than the man who did it, she said quietly. Daniel bowed his head. Lauren has moved out for now. I filed for separation this morning. Margaret did not react with triumph. She only nodded once, because consequences were never celebrations to her. They were simply the price people paid for choices they refused to question in time. Daniel looked up at her with the raw vulnerability of a son, who finally understood how much damage he had caused. I know I do not deserve it, he said, but I want to rebuild this. If you will let me. Margaret finally met his eyes. You do not rebuild trust with words, Daniel. You rebuild it with time, with consistency, with truth repeated until it no longer has to be questioned. He nodded quickly. I will do whatever it takes. Margaret studied him for a long moment, then looked back down at the child in her arms. Then start by raising him better, she said softly. Teach him that marriage does not require abandoning the people who loved him first. Teach him that loyalty without discernment becomes weakness. Teach him that real strength is thinking for yourself. Daniel broke then, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs as years of blindness and regret collapsed under the weight of truth. Margaret did not rush to comfort him. Some pain needed to be felt fully if it was ever going to change a person. She simply continued rocking her grandson, steady and composed, The way she had once rocked Daniel through fevers and nightmares when he was too young to know what safety felt like. Later, after Daniel left and the house grew quiet once more, Margaret stood at the front window watching his car disappear down the street. The pain of betrayal had not vanished. The memory of that hospital hallway would never fully leave her. But neither would the lesson it taught. Love without boundaries invites disrespect. Generosity without discernment breeds entitlement. And motherhood, she had learned too late, did not guarantee loyalty from the child you raised. So, as she looked down at the faint imprint of her grandson's tiny fingers against her blouse, Margaret allowed herself the smallest, quietest smile. They had tried to erase her from the family she built. Instead, they had reminded her exactly who she was. And Margaret Hayes had never needed anyone's permission to matter.